Sydney trains. If you live in Sydney, you're almost guaranteed to have used them. And while the current network is pretty good, at least by international standards, I'm looking at you, America, it's not perfect. So I thought it'd be fun to sit down and discuss some of the small, quality of life changes that I think Sydney trains could make to improve it. So for my first suggestion, we have button-controlled doors. If you're from Melbourne, this is probably something you're already familiar with. But there, and in many cities around the world, train doors don't open automatically. You have to press a button for them to open. So why would I want to bring this to Sydney? Simple. If you ever waited for the train at the end of the line, like in Macarthur or Richmond, while the trains are sitting there for 10 or so minutes, while they wait to depart, they have the doors open the entire time. So the interior ends up the same as the exterior. If you introduce door buttons, the air conditioner will be more effective at bringing the interior to a comfortable temperature. The main benefit is at terminating stations, but it goes to intermediate stops too. Since now the train doesn't have open all its doors at every stop, which helps to keep the interior cooler. This doesn't just work for temperature, by the way. It also helps keep the rain out on wet days and the wind out on windy days, which helps keep the train comfier for more of the year. This also isn't a new concept for Sydney either. The new D-set fleet has them, as well as the Oscar fleet and the former G-set Tangaras, which is what those green buttons are for, by the way. They're not really used all that often, but it's not a new operating principle. But I also hear you cry, what about for those busy stations during peak hour, like the city circle? Simple. Our trains already are able to track both time and their location. That's how the internal passenger information displays work after all. You can easily just configure the doors to be automatic at specific times or specific stations. There is also the issue of retrofitting the suburban fleet with this feature, but it's not essential and it works fine without it now. So ideally, I'd like to see it just be fitted to new trains in the future, like the Tangara replacement fleet, which should be ordered soon. There is also the option of air curtains, like you find at takeaway shops, but they can be noisy, but again, either work. But while we're on the topic of buttons, emergency points. You find them both on the train, typically in the vestibule, or on the platform, in this weird orange egg-shaped thing. They serve a pretty good purpose. If you have an emergency, for some reason don't have a phone, you can still reach out for help. That's all they're really for, which is a shame because they could do so much more. In the United Kingdom, in quite a few countries, station-mounted points can be used to ask for travel directions and advice, just when the next train is, or how to get somewhere, which can be really helpful if people don't have a phone and or can't find a customer service attendant to help them. Sure, there are the passenger information displays too that show you when the next train is, but not all stations have them, and they can't give you travel directions. But all stations have an emergency point, so adding the ability to ask for travel information will provide a great benefit without a lot of cost or new infrastructure. And it's not like we need to set up new infrastructure on the other end anyway. Both the Metro and Light Rail have custom information lines in their help points, and at some stations, they are already commuter phones, so they'd really just be adding this feature to the existing help points. The train-mounted points work a bit differently. They go to the guard first, and they control if the guard doesn't pick up, but could also serve a similar purpose when it comes to asking for commuter information. Or they could also be used to ask for the guard to stop the train at request stops. It'd only really be helpful on intercity trains, but if you get to tell the guard when you board, it's a good way of informing them without having to go hunt for them. Now moving away from trains and onto stations, I'm sure you've all been to the city circle, at least at some point, so you'll be aware of the ads, which I'm not necessarily a fan of, but the most egregious are the audio ads. While typical visual ads are intrusive and annoying, audio ads have an issue because they're played over the same PA as actual announcements. Why is this an issue? Well, let's imagine a scenario. You're waiting on the platform listening to music, like many people do, and you hear an announcement through your headphones, so you take them off to listen, only for it to be an ad. And then when it happens again, you do the same, with it also being an ad. Only for the third time it happens, you decide you don't want to hear an ad, so you just leave them on. Except this time, it's an actual announcement, and you miss an important piece of information. Obviously, that's a fake scenario, but I'm sure you can see my point. We should create a hard line between advertisements and important information in our stations so people don't ignore them thinking they're an ad. Plus, audio ads are just annoying, so you get rid of them. And while we're on the topic of annoying things, peak hour fares. I don't really think they serve a purpose. So for those who don't know, fares in New South Wales are based on distance travelled and the cost changes depending on the time you travel. So if your journey starts or ends between the times of 6:30 and 10 a.m. in the morning, or 3 to 7 p.m. in the evening, you'll be charged 30% more for your journey. This structure applies on all modes except intercity, which starts their morning peak at 6 a.m. instead of 6:30. If you've heard about the concept of induced demand, you probably know this already, but in general, If you make a service more accessible, cheaper, or easier to use, more people will want to use it. And if you make it more difficult, expensive, or harder to use, less people will use it. In this, peak hour fares increase the cost to discourage people from using peak hour services. But the problem is, not everyone can just stop using them. For instance, people who work 9 to 5 often can't change their schedules. And if they can, they'd have to come in either really early or finish really late to avoid them. And even then, they more than likely can afford the additional 30% cost, so they just pay it. On the other hand, shift workers and recreational travellers can change their schedule and often choose to travel off-peak. But speaking from my own experience, they don't travel off-peak to save money, but instead to avoid the crowds, which if you go back to induced demand, is making the service harder to use, so they use it less. So at least as I see it, peak hour fares can't really be effective at their job, as commuters who have inflexible schedules can't change their travel times. And people who can avoid them avoid peak hours anyway because it's more difficult to use trains at those times. So really, peak hour fares just serve as an additional tax on commuters. But you know what other charge needs to go? The airport surcharge. The airport line, uniquely at the time, was built under a public-private partnership, where private companies would finance the line on the condition they had the right to charge station access fees for a period of 30 years. Originally, this applied to all 4 stations, those being Green Square, Mascot, Domestic Airport, and International Airport. Eventually, the fees at Green Square and Mascot were abolished in 2011, but the surcharges at the airport remain. So for those who haven't used it, how much do you think it is? $2? $5? $10? No. For an adult Opal card, it's $15.74 on top of your existing fare, which is a fair bit of money. So, does this compensate the airport for loss of parking revenue? Or provision of infrastructure? No, it goes straight into the pockets of the university's superannuation scheme in the United Kingdom, which bought the Airport Link company from Westpac. So because of a private company charging a $15 fee, there are now additional parking requirements at the airport, because the additional charge means more people drive, and more cars means more pollution and traffic, which in turn, we all pay for. In my opinion, the airport surcharge should go. The deal only runs until 2030, so the government should just cover the cost of the final 7 years, same as how they cover the cost of Green Square and Mascot currently. And up to 2030, just abolish the charges altogether. If they did this, we'd probably see patronage at the airport stations jump, just like how they jumped 70% at Green Square and Mascot when they abolished them in 2011. And that was only a $2 surcharge, so I'd imagine it'd jump more at the airport. And so, those are my 5 suggestions. Install door buttons on trains, commuter information at emergency help points, removing audio ads from stations, abolishing peak hour fares, and abolishing the airport surcharge. But I'm only one person out of the millions that live in Sydney. And while I'm sure I could keep going, I want to turn this over to you. What changes would you make? Leave them in the comments below. I plan on doing a follow-up to this video, going over your suggestions and giving my opinion on them. So if you feel like there's something you want to say, leave it in the comments. Depending on the response, I may expand it to more forms of transport. Otherwise, if you enjoyed it, please like and please subscribe. It really helps the channel.